Hey guys, welcome back. Today we are going to be reviewing for our upcoming EOC end of course exam in which we are going to be tested over the U.S. Constitution. And so this is a little crash course in American government, and we're going to be taking a look today at some of the philosophical backgrounds to our government. We're going to look at the first, frankly, failed government of what would become the United States and the Articles of Confederation, and we will finish by talking about the Constitutional Convention. Lecture number 2 will deal with some specific branches of government. We're going to take a look at the legislative branch first, and then the executive branch, and then the final third lecture will deal with the judicial branch. We'll take a look at some cases of the Supreme Court over the years that were quite influential, and then we'll finish up by taking a look at some random civics areas that we weren't able to cover in some of the previous areas. So let's go ahead and jump into it, get started with the presentation. All right, here we go. So principles of government. So, a lot of words that I'm going to be using today often get thrown around fairly flippantly, but they do have very direct meanings that, need to be understood if we're to truly understand not only the importance of our government, but, why it was put in place. So the first slide here, we're dealing with democracy. We are a democracy, which is a government by the people, in which they vote for their representatives, or in some cases, if it's a direct democracy, they act as their own representatives. But you break down that word, and of course, most of us are probably familiar with the fact that democracy was born in ancient Greece, one of the first areas we ever saw it. You break it down, it is a Greek word, demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning power. So it literally means the power of the people. Now, like I said, a democracy can look different depending on what system is being used. In many of the small polis of Greece, the small city-states, where they literally knew everyone in these cities, it was much easier to engage in what was called direct democracy, where people acted as their own representative in government. Now, I should mention that this was not like a utopian democracy in ancient Greece. In fact, I would say roughly around maybe 30% of people actually participated in government, because it was frankly the male property owners. Females were not given representation in these ancient systems. They were often heavily slave societies, which were not given representation. So there has really not been a democracy on earth that had full participation from all their members, and even though you like to think that we've gotten to the point where we have a lot of people that have the ability to participate in our own democracy. For instance, most of the people watching this video are under 18 and will not be able to vote. So, there's, and again, not saying right or wrong, but, democracy is not something that everyone is able to participate. There are often barriers, and in our own country, sometimes that's been racially based. So, that's something that we have to contend with as we look throughout history. So, direct democracy, it somewhat existed. The most usual form that we see today, which because it is easier in larger countries, which the United States is huge, right? It's one of the largest democracies that's ever existed, is what we call a representative democracy, in which citizens will elect officials to represent them in government. So, we see this a little bit more in ancient Rome, with the Roman Republic. A republic is when the government is held, the government power is held by the citizens, and they are, the government power is exercised by representatives. So, it's basically, at least in Roman history, it was the next step after monarchy, right? So you had, the singular king. A republic, actually in ancient Rome, they did keep some of the same institutions. Even the Senate existed under monarchy, but a republic, one in which government power is held by the citizens, exercised by representatives. So I know it gets confusing. What's a republic? What's a democracy? So a democracy is when you vote, into the system, government by the people, where they vote, for specific action they want the government to take. A republic is where you have representatives, okay? Now, we vote for those representatives, so it's accurate to say that we are both a republic and a democracy. We practice our republic through democratic means. Okay, so we are a republican democracy. So democratic republic. I know that gets tricky, but it's kind of two different things, and how you select your representation, and who is actually doing the representing. I talked about ancient Greece earlier, and ancient Greece is often brought up in these forms because they did experiments. Greece is so unique, its geography, in which you have this very mountainous country, and in ancient times, these city-states were independent. They were individual, and they were able to experiment with different things. Many of them were monarchies. They had their own king and queen, like Sparta. And that usually was hereditary, meaning it passed on to generation after generation. Some of those actually claimed divine right, and we would see that later on in Europe. We'd see that even in China, places like that, where they claim that power to rule comes from God. That God put this person in this position, and they've been hand selected, basically. So therefore, it becomes difficult to overthrow at that point, right? I mean, do you really want to overthrow a king that society believes has been selected by God? Probably not the best motto to get a revolution started. The next one is another term we often see thrown around, and frankly, rightfully so today, but that is oligarchy, and that is when the power is held by the minority, usually a self-appointed elite or an aristocracy. So, I don't know, I don't think we can necessarily argue that we have an aristocracy in America. We have, elite, but aristocracy, it's more so, wealth being passed down generation to generation. Which, of course, you do have that here, but in this situation, you have just the elite ruling, and I've seen articles that suggest that America has become an oligarchy. I still think that's probably erroneous at this time. I can see some of the points that are made with that. Especially when you look at, the people that are in government, millionaires, billionaires. Very rarely do you have, the common man actually representing people in Congress. Not to say it doesn't happen, but it is often very wealthy and people that are very networked and tied to others. So, again, it's a dangerous thing. We see it in ancient Greece that, these oligarchies controlled, quite ruthlessly at times. But we need to be careful to avoid that in our own future. The next term, plutocracy. This is government by the wealthy. So in a plutocracy, only the wealthy are able to make the decisions. And again, we've seen all of these in ancient Greece. Totalitarian style government. This, of course, we almost always talk about when we're discussing Mussolini and Hitler. A government that fully subjugates the individual, controls all aspects of individual life. So think about what you know from Nazi Germany, right? They completely controlled people's lives, especially minorities, especially Jews, denying them all rights, basically, but, they would define on even who you could marry, what kind of job you would have. So, those are totalitarian states. We see it today in North Korea, and, I know there's been some strides to try and have a little bit more diplomacy with North Korea, but they still are a very totalitarian state. You are born and you are told what your education will be, or you are told what your job will be. And so that is, frankly, one of the only totalitarian states to still exist today. Next up, a very important term that will come up, frankly, in one of our next units, and that is popular sovereignty, where this is the idea that the people are the subject of political power, and that the people are the ones ruling. So we do have popular sovereignty as a part of our system, where the people are the ones ruling. You look at the first few words of the Constitution, the preamble: "We, the people." Okay, not saying we, the descendants of King blah blah blah. We, the people, are the ones that are writing this document. So that idea that the people are the ones ruling, not wealthy or elite aristocracy, but the people are the ones ruling it. Very important in our own system. When we got to the Age of Enlightenment, which I brought up quite a bit in our numerous units, we see the impact of political philosophy on actual governance, and that period, the 1600s, 1700s, so influential in our own system in particular on how government was conducted. This man here, Rousseau came up with this idea called the social contract. And, no one had really defined it up to this point, but everybody kind of understood that this really was the case. The social contract is the idea that we will surrender some of our freedoms and submit to authority in exchange for certain things, okay? In exchange for, first of all, the protection of certain rights. The rights to remain safe. I mean, we have security. Government is responsible for providing security. So, we give up some freedoms. We give up some of our rights in exchange for others, for protections. In this society. Rousseau believed that democracy was the best way of ensuring the general welfare while maintaining as much individual freedom as possible. You think about the extremes. If you have complete individual freedom, society would be chaotic. It would be anarchy, where there's really no laws to violate if you have complete individual freedom. And so if that's the case, then no one would be able to stop someone else from violating your freedom. Okay? I mean, even murder, in a completely fictitious scenario, would be legal. On the full other side, where government has all the power, you have no individual freedom. You have, those totalitarian states I just referring to. So it's a balance, and that's what governance really is. And that's one thing I took from my political science classes, is that governance is truly a balance between freedom and protection and security. So we give up some of our rights in the form of protection, and that's something that's always a fine line. That is, frankly, one of the biggest factors between Democrats and Republicans, is how much security, how much freedom should one have. Moving on with Enlightenment philosophers, the next up is John Locke, and John Locke proposed what were called natural rights. Now, this theory was that humans have natural or inalienable, meaning that they cannot be taken away. Okay? Cannot be taken away. That God is the one that gave these, that supersedes all government authority, and that the right to freedom of speech is not one that is given. We have these certain rights. Life, liberty. What Locke said was property. Okay? We have the right to property, to own things without others taking them. So this idea of natural rights, that there are certain things that, while governments may define them, and many of them appear in our Bill of Rights, there are certain things that should be undeniable, that people should always have protected. The final item under this governmental philosophy that I want to touch on is the separation of powers by Montesquieu. And we will see this wholeheartedly in our own Constitution when that is eventually written in 1787. But this was the idea that branches of government should be separate. And what he did was stress the importance of, in particular, the judicial branch to prevent the despotism of the executive branch. These men all studied history. They all understood what had worked before, what hadn't worked before. They had seen the despotism of the Roman Empire destroying the Roman Republic. And, a lot of these guys looked back and said, well, what did work for them? And in particular in the Roman Republic, there was this idea that these branches were separate. Now, they didn't have the exact same three branches that we have. They actually combined. I think they had another branch called the deliberative branch. But anyways, the idea that each branch has certain powers, none of them, especially the executive, have all-encompassing powers. They're separated and they're defined, and that should stop the growth of power among those branches, but it keeps the other ones in check. So Montesquieu is going to be leaned on very heavily by our founders in writing of the Constitution. All right, so we're going to move on to the next section here in the foundations of American government. What came before that led up to eventually the Constitution? Well, you got to go way back in time, hundreds of years, to the Magna Carta in 1215. This was a document signed in England, which basically the nobles kind of forced the king to sign, which limited the power of the king himself. This also went a step further and guaranteed those fundamental rights, the rule of law, which is the idea that no official is above the law, that the president can't go out and kill someone, and that they need to be held responsible. Right to trial by jury. These are things that we find in our own Bill of Rights that are popping up here in the Magna Carta, and due process, another one of those. The Magna Carta was very important. Now, this was not as enlightened as what would come later. I mean, this really only applied to noblemen and property owners and things like that. But what we see is kind of the first step of limiting the power of the monarchy, limiting the executive power, and that starts a trend where the people find they don't have to listen to one individual person making so many fateful decisions that fit into their lives. Fast forward to the Mayflower Compact, one of the first governing documents in the American colonies. We talked about this at the very beginning of the year. This was a compact that was signed by those on the ship the Mayflower, and basically set the rules, the governance for what it was going to be like over here. And sometimes you don't think about the logistics of that, but these people were stuck on a boat for weeks, coming over to wilderness inhabited by, of course, Native Americans, but for the most part they're on their own, right? They cannot lean on the government of Great Britain that they are coming from to make these governmental decisions. So in 1620 they signed their own compact, which basically set these laws in place, and we see kind of really the birth of American democracy here, because they did have to lean on each other so much. Again, rooted in this kind of smaller, the smaller sample size where it works a little bit better. Now, fast forward a little bit to the Declaration of Independence, and of course, this came in the middle of our American Revolution. Jefferson, who one of my favorite founding fathers, wasn't necessarily the best president, but made a lot of critical errors. But Jefferson, one reason I like him is because he was such a Renaissance man. He was very well written. He was, he read everything from science to philosophy, all these different things, and incorporated that into his decision making. He wholeheartedly believed in natural rights, and so you find these phrases in our own Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and he changed it to pursuit of happiness. But we do find these rights listed right there, so heavily influenced from these Enlightenment philosophers. But some of these, all of these that we've talked about so far: natural rights, popular sovereignty, representation, separation of powers, checks and balances. These are all things that I've just mentioned that were basically culminated in what would become the American government. One that was founded in a belief that the people could rule, that the tyranny of a king, in this case thousands of miles away, could be overthrown by the people, and they could rule themselves. So, a pretty amazing moment in world history. I think sometimes we fall and are susceptible to the idea of, American exceptionalism, but this is a pretty exceptional moment in the course of human history, where they say we can govern ourselves, that we do not need a king to make decisions for us. Now, that being said, the first round of them actually trying this self-government was a disaster, and we're going to talk about that right now with the Articles of Confederation. So, from 1777, which is right smack dab in the middle of the Revolution, all the way up to 1787, which would be the year that the Constitution Convention happened, where they wrote the Constitution. You had this, and they're in a tough spot, right? I mean, they're trying to fight this war, and at the same time, they're declaring independence. Well, if you declare independence, you better have a functioning government of some kind. So they put together a highly idealistic government, and it's called the Articles of Confederation. Now, that word confederation means friendship. It means kind of, it means friendship. So what they're saying is these states are friends together in somewhat of a union. I don't know if I want to call that, because that would They're not completely unified like what we would see under the federal system. But this so-called League of States, it failed for a lot of reasons, and we'll get into more detail here in a second. The biggest was that they were so idealistic in this push that they actually got rid of the executive branch for the most part. There was technically a president of the Confederation, but it was more like a secretary almost. So this League of States really had no executive government. And what they're going to realize is that, ultimately, while that power is often abused throughout history, you do need to have at least kind of a singular figure, or at least a group of individuals that are enforcing the laws, that are pushing to make sure that things are happening. So let's talk about the setup here of the Articles of Confederation, because we see a couple of arguments that are being made early on, but that are going to remain. How much power should be given to a centralized government, right? So you had some that were ultimately going to become the Federalists, and they say that we do need a strong central government, and they would make this argument more so after the war. Men like Hamilton, major Federalists, John Jay, these guys are going to push for a strong federal government after the war. The anti-federalists, and frankly, I wish my lecture was a little bit different here, because this argument belongs more so after the Articles of Confederation is actually formed. The Federalist, anti-Federalist argument really comes in the 1780s. We do see some, discussion, but right now the major crisis when they're writing the Articles of Confederation is about, it's about the war, really. It's not about, coming up with the best functioning government. It's a high stress situation. And, so anyways, we see this argument a little bit here, but really that Federalist, anti-Federalist stance is going to come later on. So I need to change the lecture, but, hopefully you're following along. The anti-federalists said that you can operate within a looser set of states that to limit the tyranny of a king or federal government, and so that's kind of the main argument. How much power should a unified government have here? Now, what the Articles of Confederation did was make each state sovereign. Okay, they had their own power, and this is kind of the doom of the Articles of Confederation, is that there is no unifying power. It's kind of it's this loose collection of friendship, and if one state doesn't want to go along with the rest, they don't have to, and that's not going to allow for much unification. And when big decisions have to be made, they're not going to be able to do them. So, the Articles was a great experiment, but failed miserably, and they realized perhaps there is some balance that is needed, between, completely ridding ourselves of executive power and, on the other side, allowing tyranny to continue. Some other principles here, you can see there what the Articles allowed for. You could move between states, so they wanted to prevent a situation like Europe where, you had these strong borders that, made it difficult for trade or, immigration. They wanted people to move freely between states. But everyone would be seen equal in the eyes of the law. Again, that is much easier to say than actually do at this time. But, you can see some other, descriptions here. Could not raise taxes. That's going to be really the nail in the coffin, that they cannot raise taxes at a centralized level. They could not engage in war without permission of the Congress of Confederation, and each state was allowed one vote. And frankly, one of the biggest problems for them is going to be that all decisions basically had to be unanimous. Well, how easy is it to really get every state to agree on everything? So here we go. We got a list of the major weaknesses of the Articles. Taxation. I put this one first because it is by far the biggest. They don't have, there is no power to tax the people. And, again, more idealistic. Hey, that sounds great. We don't want to send off a tax to a centralized government thousands of miles away. So idealistic in thought, but, it just means that when the government does decide to do something, they don't have the money to enforce it. There's no military to enforce it. So they could say, everybody has to donate, a horse to their local city council, there's no way to enforce that because there's no funding. There's no money to actually hire soldiers to enforce the laws. The second, military. And so, again, without the power to tax, you don't have the power to raise an army on its own. That makes it difficult to conduct foreign policy. Okay, so that means that each individual state is going to have to basically sign their own treaties and have their own diplomats when they negotiate with big, powerful countries like France and Britain. That's going to be very difficult. I mean, Rhode Island and New York are supposed to have, they're supposed to, both sign treaties with France. I mean, it just doesn't work out like that. So, it does make it very hard to conduct foreign policy under this system. The third point, economics. Each state had its own currency under the Articles of Confederation, and that makes it pretty chaotic, especially when you're doing interstate trade. What is a Massachusetts dollar worth versus a South Carolinian dollar? So further complicating, a lot of these issues in terms of economics and currency. And then, you really didn't have the ability to force states to compel. So enforcement is the final one. There's no central executive, meaning that no state has to comply with the demands of another formed under the Articles. This makes it very difficult to pass resolutions and then to enact them, to force any decision onto the people itself. So what did America look like under the Articles of Confederation? It's there's some good, there's some bad. There's some chaos, and right off the bat, 1786. And, I think it is worthy of note that this takes place a year before they decide to get ready to write the Constitution, to scrap the Articles and to write the Constitution. In 1786, there's frankly, a major rebellion that takes place called Shays' Rebellion. And this took place by the farmers, and I believe, I'm sorry, I should have read up on this. I believe it's in Massachusetts, in western Massachusetts, where these farmers were basically, they had very large debts, and they were being forced to pay taxes to the state, and they're basically losing their farms. And many of these were veterans of the American Revolution. They're saying, listen, we fought for independence, but now we're literally losing our livelihood and our homes, our shelter, because of a government forcing us to pay a tax. Like, isn't that the whole purpose of what we fought against? So you had a number of people take up arms, and their goal was to overthrow this system, to overthrow the state government. And what's interesting is the hero of the day shows up. George Washington himself comes out of retirement. He's getting to be older, and by the way, he hasn't even been president yet. He's just kind of the hero of the revolution. But he comes out of retirement to put this rebellion down. But all the states are realizing this isn't working. We need a different system. And so, like I said, the following year there is going to be a major push to try and rectify some of these wrongs. Now, that following year, in 1787, we do see another law passed by under the Articles. That is known as the Northwest Territory. They're going to organize the Northwest Territory. And this is really a big moment in the formation of our country for numerous ways. This successfully adds some of that. Well, let's go back to the American Revolution. We defeat the British, right? And part of what they signed away in the Treaty of Paris was all this land basically up to the Mississippi. All right. So that incorporates what you can see there on the map: Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, parts of Minnesota there. So all of those states, that would be states, there's kind of open territory. There are some British forts there. Of course, there are many native tribes in this area. But the government decided that it was time to organize them. And they're going to start trying to push westward movement, even in this early period. So you have to organize them first in order to get people to move out there. So the Northwest Ordinance, Northwest Territory here, they did successfully organize it, and we're going to go into more detail. There's some very interesting notes about it, but just know that this was one successful thing pushed by the the Confederation of States that they were able to get successfully passed. One big thing that won't be on the test, but is a major part of a future unit, is that one big thing that they pushed in the Northwest Ordinance was that this territory should remain slave-free. And we are going to argue when we get to 1861, about what led to this, what led to the Civil War, and of course slavery. I mean, is the only answer. Even everything else, all subject matter around it, economics, politics, it's all tied back to slavery. And a lot of people in the South are going to point to the fact that our founding fathers allowed for slavery, therefore they should have it. But here's the deal: they stopped its spread. Okay, and this is really what Abraham Lincoln and the Free Soil Party is, the beginnings of the Republican Party. That's what they're going to push eventually. They point to the Northwest Ordinance and they say, look, even here, they said that as we move west, there should not be slavery in these territories. So this is a major moment that's going to have ramifications later on and will be used by the Union to say that slavery, or at least by the party, that slavery does not automatically extend. That this is not a right. You do not have a right to slavery. But they would make that argument in the South, and again, one of the big reasons that the Civil War does come up. Moving on, the end of the Articles. They realized after this, Shays' Rebellion and all that there were some major problems that had to be rectified, and so they did decide to meet in the city of Annapolis, and about 12 states sent representatives to discuss things like trade regulations. But what they end up ultimately talking about is scrapping the Articles and the need for a constitutional convention. So they decide that the following May they are going to meet in Philadelphia, and they are going to discuss whether a constitution is needed, a new form of government is needed, and ultimately, of course, that is what takes place. So 1787. I despise Kanye. Sorry, Kanye, if you're listening to this. But anyways, I thought this was funny. Anyway, you can read it on your own. So anyways, let's talk about the convention itself. Talk about what they discussed at this convention. The intention of the convention itself was to fix the Articles. But what they realized once they really got into it was that really nobody was happy with what was going on, and that they decided a newer form of government was needed to strengthen the federal powers. That there did need to be some level of centralized government. They disagreed on how much there should be, and we still are disagreeing on that today. But the result is basically the Constitution. Okay, so the Constitution will outline what our government can and cannot do, but it sets up our government with the three branches and a list of rights and in the first 10 amendments. As I was alluding to earlier, you have two groups that form that are for the Constitution. They are known as the Federalists. This will absolutely be on your test, by the way. You absolutely need to know this. You have the Federalists on one side that are pushing for things for the Constitution, and you have their main goal is to have a strong executive, not an overpowering or tyrant in office, but a strong executive that is in kind of the head of a national government that is over all of these states. Some major Federalists there. James Madison will be known as the father of the Constitution. He will do a lot of the writing of the Constitution. You absolutely need to know James Madison is the father of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, as I already mentioned, he would be the first Secretary of the Treasury, and of course quite famous today, given his reincarnation on Broadway. They will write a series of papers called the Federalist Papers, and this would ultimately be put into a single collection. But what it actually originally was a group of letters to newspapers around the country that were arguing for a constitution to be written. It was a total of 85 essays that were written by Hamilton and Madison, but also John Jay, who would become Supreme Court justice later on, Chief Justice. And they were really promoting this ratification of the Constitution. It was very well organized, very well thought out. And today, I mean, it's basically scripture, that the Federalist Papers really outline what many of the founding fathers believed about what, the nature and characteristics of the federal government. Now, on the other side, you had anti-federalists, and, they feared that, here we had just fought off Britain, this strong government, this king, this tyrant. They feared that a federal government would trample the rights of citizens, that a president would eventually turn into a monarch. You can call him a president, but he's a king, okay? And their fears, I mean, there were reasons for their fears. And I think today, if they looked at our system, they would be shocked at how much power the President of the United States has, and probably quite disappointed, honestly, as to the size and scope of our government, but also how much power the executive does have. Some major anti-federalists involved here. Patrick Henry, who we saw a lot in the Revolution, standing up against Britain, very adamant against that. John Adams was an anti-federalist, which is interesting because he would ultimately run for the Federalist Party. George Mason, another one. I have Thomas Jefferson listed up here. You should note that Thomas Jefferson was actually not in the country at the time. He was one that often pushed for individual liberty, but he wasn't a big fan of the Constitution or the federal government. So I've included him here, but there was this fear among many of those men. Let's take a look at some of the issues that were discussed here. First of all, dealing with representation. How should the people be represented? And you may have never thought about this, but do you give more representation to the bigger states, states that have a lot of people, or do you give more representation, equal representation? Just because you are a state, you should have the same rights and privileges of other states, right? So those are the two main arguments. And the Virginia plan, and again, these things will absolutely be on your test. You have to know these things. So please make sure that you're paying attention to this section. The Virginia plan said that we should have what's called a bicameral legislative branch. Bicameral means two houses, and the legislative branch would be it would basically be based off of population. Okay, so that made sense. Virginia is the biggest state at the time. Remember, what is today West Virginia was a part of Virginia at this time. It was basically double in size, and it was the most populated state of all of them. So it made sense that they thought that representation should be based off of size. On the flip side of that, New Jersey plan, where they thought that everyone should have equal representation. And that, just because they're a smaller state in terms of land area and population doesn't mean that they shouldn't have the same rights and privileges as other states. The compromise that is eventually reached is what becomes known as the Connecticut Compromise, and it said let's take both of these. All right, let's take both these plans. The Virginia plan, we will turn that into the House of Representatives, to where the bigger states do have more representation. And today, states like California, Texas, New York, they do have more representation, and they do have more power to control the House than other states. But they said, you should have some equality based off just being a state, and that's where they came up with the idea for the Senate. So the Senate, the kind of upper house, this is when smaller states like Rhode Island, or in population-wise, Wyoming, they have equal representation in the Senate, as does California. So that is part of the New Jersey plan. So Connecticut was the one that brought us together on that. And this really did satisfy both the large and small states. So there was a lot of thought that went into this. After all, they've had 10 years of a failed government. They've had time to think about it. One of the other big issues that they're going to have to discuss is the issue of slavery. Even by 1787, the North and South were completely divided on this issue of slavery. Many of the northern states, I think Vermont was the first to do this, but have already declared abolition, emancipation for their slaves, and abolition in their states, meaning no slavery was allowed. Of course, Southerners are going to fight and literally die for their right to retain slavery. And So anyways, the question became what to do about the slaves. And I will tell you, this is the stickiest situation they dealt with in the Constitutional Convention. We are seeing so much of what will lead to the Civil War, and they cannot get past this issue in the Constitutional Convention. In fact, I think one of the biggest, and Jefferson even admitted to this, but one of the biggest failures of this generation is not dealing with the slavery issue. And Jefferson even wrote that basically they were saving it for their grandchildren to deal with. And he was right, that eventually the slavery issue would serve to either keep us as a disunited people, or we would have to make a decision that would cover one. We were either going to be all slave or we're either going to be all free. I mean, Lincoln said that, and he was right about that. So, anyways, I'm on my soapbox here. But what should we do? You know, we have the opportunity right here to ban slavery. Well, you better believe that Southerners are not going to allow that to happen. Not only, I mean, all of their wealth in the South is wrapped up in slaves, and we'll get into that in our next unit of how much money actually was invested in slaves. But the fact is, that's where all the wealth was. They could not let go of slavery, even at this early period of American history. They could not let it go, and they are going to. Southern states are basically going to say, "We're walking out of here if you do not allow slavery." It was off the table. I mean, we are not going to sign anything unless slavery is allowed. So. You know, I think rightfully so. This generation is criticized for, allowing slavery to continue, but, they had to look at, what, kind of deal with the greater evil, what they could deal with at the time. And it's a tough pill for us to swallow, but, frankly, if they did not allow slavery, Southerners would walk away and there would be no Constitution. And, given the chaos of the last 10 years, they had to have something. So it was a failure. It was a failure of this generation that would have to be dealt with in blood later on. But they realized that they had to kind of sell out future generations in order to get this deal done at this time. So what made this more complicated than it needed to be was that by the 1780s, large numbers of slaves had been brought into the country already, and really there were at this time about a fifth of the population were slaves. So 20% of all the people in America were slaves. Most of those were centered in the South, about 90%. Like I said, some northern states have already gotten rid of slavery by this point, but about 90% of those are in the South. So they are economically dependent on it, and it is going to be, they did not think that their economy and therefore their states, their livelihood would be able to survive without it. And in a lot of ways they were right, because after the Civil War, the South is going to be economically destroyed for, the better part of a century. So anyways, it's, you still drive through the South today, you see some of the poorest regions of the entire country. So in a lot of ways you could say that they never ever recovered from this. But they were able to reach some agreements, and one of those agreements was to end the international slave trade. Now, they gave it 20 years. They said, you can basically import slaves over the next 20 years, but basically in 1807, the slave trade should come to an end, and for the most part it did. There was still some smuggling, but Southerners realized that for 20 years, and this sounds very coarse, but it was true, their thought process here. You import as many as you can in 20 years. For the most part, they will turn to a system of slave trade in which they are more focused on breeding slaves instead of importing them. It's cheaper than buying one from a middleman slave trader, but they realize, hey, 20 years we can get enough here that we can frankly breed future generations, and it's difficult to talk like that, but that was their mentality at the time. Probably the most critical point of the Constitutional Convention is the compromise that is made regarding slavery. You had Southern states that were denying all rights and privileges to these individuals of slaves, but yet they wanted them to be counted for population purposes, and the North basically said no way. and they finally reached an agreement called the Three-Fifths Compromise that for purposes of representation, Africans, African Americans, but for the most part, I mean, these people were from Africa, stolen and imported here. But these individuals would be counted as 3/5 of a person. Man, I mean, sure, it was a compromise that was able to get the Constitution written, but you can see the hypocrisy here. I mean, you start this document talking about all these Enlightenment, philosophies and life, liberty, and or at least going back to the Declaration. But here they've arrived at literally trying to assign a percentage as to how human someone is. It's kind of disgusting when you put it that way. But there are ramifications, of course, to whether slaves would be counted as people. How much tax would have to be paid, all that stuff. So slavery will remain a major issue, and frankly, we're still living with the sins of our fathers even today, and a lot of our racial unrest deals with what is being born out of this period right here. The third major issue that has to be decided is the protection of rights, and Anti-Federalists feared that if you did not have a list of rights, that they would be easily trampled upon, and they were most likely right, because here they had just fought this revolution against this tyrant King George, and they thought a large federal government would just be as tyrannical. So they finally agreed. The Anti-Federalists did agree to a constitution if the rights could be written down. So that is where the first 10 amendments come from. This idea that these are enumerated, they are written rights that needed to be defined and needed to be recorded, so that way they would not be violated. Now, I found it always interesting that some of the Federalists, no one was against these rights. No one said, "Oh, you don't have freedom of speech." But what some of the Federalists were arguing, namely Madison, he said, "Listen, the Constitution's written in a way that if it's not in there, government can't do it." All right, so he's saying, freedom of assembly. Right? You don't need to write down that you have the freedom of assembly because it's not written down in there that the government can deny your freedom of assembly. Right? So he's saying we don't need this. It's unnecessary because the government does not, it's not written down that the government can violate these rights. So therefore they don't have the power to do it. Now, he was probably being a little naive there because as the years have gone on, we realize how important it is to have and by the way, he did mention also that, you follow a dangerous path. You start writing down your rights, well, you're going to miss some. You're going to not include everything, and especially as decades and generations go by. I mean, society changes. You're going to have things that the government may be able to violate because they're not written down. He says government can't do it if it's not written down, so therefore don't worry about it. Well, again, a little naive, I think, because today, of course, how much of our rights that have been defined by the Bill of Rights are, what we rely on in the court of law. Like, you do not have, to follow due process, Fourth Amendment, the government needed to follow this, and they didn't. So I think it was an important step, and I'm glad they included it there. But I have always found it interesting ideologically to think that they were against the Bill of Rights, not because they were against rights, but because they thought the Constitution wouldn't allow the government to have that much power in the first place. All right, guys, that was a longer lecture than I intended, but it was pretty fascinating stuff, and I hope that you found it interesting as well. Next time we come together, we're going to look at the breakdown of the Constitution itself. We're going to look at, what they actually put into these different articles on what the government could and could not do. Thank you so much for listening, and email me if you have any questions. Thanks.